He offered me $50,000 to fix him. 6 weeks, private sessions, non-negotiable terms. I should have said no. I should have seen it coming, but I didn't know that Damien Cross wasn't looking for a therapist. He wasn't looking to be fixed. He was hunting for a heart. Before I tell you what happened when I walked through those doors, do me a favor. If you love stories about dangerous men and the women who unravel them, press that like button. It helps these secrets find their way to others. And if you want to be the first to know how this ends, make sure you're subscribed. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday. Heavy cream paper, my name in black ink, Dr. Alara Cole, written in a hand too steady to be anything but deliberate. No return address, just the weight of it in my hands, expensive and certain. Inside, a single card, embossed lettering. I require your services by .C. Beneath it, a check, $50,000, already signed. My fingers went numb. I stood in my office doorway, rain drumming against the windows, the city bleeding gray and gold beyond the glass. The radiator hissed. My coffee had gone cold an hour ago, and I was holding more money than I'd see in 6 months. For what? The card didn't say. It didn't need to. I knew who DC was. Everyone did. Damien Cross, 34, CEO of Cross Industries, hotels, real estate, tech acquisitions. If it made money, he owned it. Forbes called him untouchable. The tabloids called him a ghost. Cold, calculating. The man who turned billion-dollar companies into empires and never smiling doing it. They said he didn't feel anything. No anger, no joy, nothing. Some called it ruthless focus. Others whispered about trauma, about something that had hollowed him out years ago. But no one knew for sure because Damien Cross didn't let anyone close enough to find out. And now he wanted me. I should have torn up the check. I had a waiting list. A small practice, sure, but it was mine. Built on ethics and boundaries and the kind of care you can't buy. I didn't take clients like him, people who thought money solved everything, who wanted a quick fix for problems that took years to build. But my student loans weren't small, and my mother's medical bills weren't getting smaller. I looked at the check again. The ink was real. The signature, unmistakable. $50,000. 6 weeks. What harm could 6 weeks do? I called the number on the card that night. It rang once. Then his voice, low, smooth, the kind that didn't ask questions. It stated facts. He called me Dr. Cole like he'd known my name his whole life. I told him I didn't typically take clients this way, that therapy doesn't work like this. Contracts and checks and non-negotiable terms. He didn't care. He told me what he wanted. 6 weeks, private sessions, his penthouse, twice a week. And when I hesitated, when I tried to explain that this wasn't how I practiced, he said something that made my breath catch. He said he'd double it. $100,000. The number hung in the air between us, like a challenge, like he was daring me to say no, daring me to prove I was different from everyone else who bent to his will. I asked him, why me? Why not someone more experienced, more equipped to handle whatever it was he needed? There was a pause, long enough that I heard the rain against my window, long enough that I wondered if he'd hung up. Then he said something I'd replay in my mind 1,000 times after. He said, I was the only one who wouldn't try to fix him for the wrong reasons. I asked what the right reasons were. He told me that's what he was paying me to figure out. Then the line went dead. I stood there for a long time, phone still pressed to my ear, listening to nothing. The rain kept falling, the city kept moving, and somewhere across town, Damien Cross was waiting for my answer. I looked at the check on my desk, then at the stack of bills beside it, the overdue notices, the voicemail from my mother's hospice care coordinator I hadn't returned yet. $100,000. 6 weeks. Just 6 weeks. I told myself it was just a job, a client, nothing I hadn't handled before. But deep down, in the part of me that knew better, I felt it. The shift. The beginning of something I wouldn't be able to walk away from. I picked up my phone, typed 3 words. I'll do it. I didn't know it then, but pressing send on that message was the easiest decision I'd make. Everything after would cost me more than money. It would cost me every rule I'd built my life on, and maybe, just maybe, my heart.
His penthouse was on the 47th floor. I watched the numbers climb in the elevator, my reflection staring back at me from the polished steel doors. Professional blazer, hair pulled back, the armor I wore when I needed to feel in control. My hands were steady, my breathing measured, but my heart knew I was walking into something I didn't understand. The elevator doors slid open to silence, not the comfortable kind, the kind that pressed against your chest and made you aware of every breath. Floor to ceiling windows, the city sprawled below like a kingdom. Minimalist furniture, black leather, chrome, glass, everything sharp, clean, cold. And then I saw him. Damien Cross stood by the windows, hands in his pockets, silhouette cut against the dying light. Tall, broad shoulders beneath a perfectly tailored black shirt. Dark hair, slightly too long, like he didn't care enough to cut it. He didn't turn around when I entered, just said my name, Dr. Cole, like he was testing how it felt in his mouth. I stepped forward, heels clicking against marble, told him my name too, keeping it professional, keeping the distance I knew I'd need. He said, I came, like he'd wondered if I actually would. I reminded him he'd paid me to. That made him turn. And God help me, I wasn't prepared. The photos didn't do him justice. Sharp jawline, eyes so dark they were almost black. Features that looked carved, not born. Handsome in a way that felt dangerous, like staring at something beautiful that could cut you if you got too close. But it was his eyes that stopped me. Empty. Not sad, not angry, just absent, like looking into a room where all the furniture had been removed. He gestured to the leather couch, not a request, an instruction. I sat, pulled out my notebook, crossed my legs, every movement deliberate, professional. He didn't sit. He stood by the windows, watching me like I was a puzzle he was deciding whether to solve. I started with boundaries, told him this was therapy, that there were rules, protocols we'd need to follow. He asked if I knew what therapy meant. His tone, flat, factual. Then he said something that made my spine straighten. He said, you talk, I pay, we both pretend it matters. I told him no, that's not what therapy is. He waited. So I told him the truth. I said, therapy is the space where you stop performing, where you don't have to be the version of yourself everyone expects, where you can just be. Something flickered across his face, too quick to name. Then it was gone. He moved then, slow, deliberate, and sat in the chair across from me. Not on the couch. Distance maintained. Control kept. He leaned back, fingers steepled beneath his chin, eyes locked on mine. Asked if he thought I was performing. I said I thought everyone was. The question was whether he even knew what was underneath anymore. His jaw tightened. The first crack in that perfect, emotionless mask. He told me to be careful, that I shouldn't assume I knew him. I said I didn't know him. That's why I was here, to understand. He asked if there was nothing to understand. I said we'd find that out together. He stared at me for a long moment. The city hummed below us. The light faded from gold to gray. Then he asked why I took the job, why I needed the money. I hesitated. This wasn't how sessions worked. I asked the questions, not him. But something in his eyes told me this was a test. So I told him. Medical bills, my mother, Alzheimer's. He nodded once. No sympathy, no platitudes, just acknowledgement. Then he said something that made my air leave my lungs. He said, "We both know what it's like to watch someone disappear. The difference is, my mother doesn't have a choice." He did. I asked him what he meant. He stood abruptly, walked back to the windows, hands in his pockets. Whoa, rebuilt. Told me the session was over. I reminded him we'd only been talking for 15 minutes. He said it again. Session's over. Final. I stood slowly, closed my notebook. Every instinct screamed to push, to dig deeper into what he'd just revealed. But I knew better. You can't force someone to open a door. You can only show them it's safe to turn the knob. I asked about Thursday, same time. He said, same time. Didn't turn around. I walked to the elevator, pressed the button. The doors opened. Then he said my name again. Dr. Cole. I turned. He was still facing the windows, silhouette against the dying light. He said I'd asked if he knew what was underneath. Said the truth is, he wasn't sure there was anything left to find. The elevator doors started to close, and just before they shut completely, I saw it. His reflection in the glass. The way his shoulders dropped, just slightly. The way his hand came up, pressed against the window, fingers splayed like he was trying to hold something in. Or keep something out. I rode the elevator down in silence. 47 floors. And with every floor, one thought kept repeating. He wasn't empty. He was buried. And I was standing at the edge of the grave, holding a shovel I wasn't sure I should use. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at my kitchen table, laptop glowing in the dark, rain streaking down the windows like the city was crying. My tea had gone cold. Again. I didn't bother reheating it. I told myself I was doing research, due diligence, understanding my client. But that wasn't it. I was looking for proof that I was wrong about him. The internet knew Damien Cross in pieces. Forbes articles, business acquisitions, charity galas where he stood in perfectly tailored tuxedos, champagne in hand, face carved from stone. Never smiling, never anything. There were photos with women, models, actresses, heiresses, always beautiful, always temporary. He never dated anyone longer than 3 months. The tabloids had theories, commitment issues, emotional unavailability. Some said he was incapable of attachment. They weren't wrong, but they didn't know why. I scrolled deeper, past the business profiles and society pages, into the archives. And then I found it. An article from 12 years ago. Small, buried. Prominent family mourns loss in tragic accident. There was a photo. Younger Damien, maybe 22, standing at a funeral. Black suit, face like granite, but his eyes were screaming. I read the article 3 times. His younger sister, Emma, 19, car accident. He'd been driving. The article didn't say much more, just that the family requested privacy, that Damien Cross had been treated and released from the hospital with minor injuries. Minor injuries. But something in him had died that night, too. I sat back, fingers trembling against the keyboard. I didn't know what to expect. I told myself that she's doing research, that he's feeling nothing, that he'd been talking about choosing it, choosing to bury everything so deep that grief couldn't find him, so guilt couldn't touch him, so love, God, so love could never hurt him again. My throat tightened. I'd seen this before. Clients who'd survived trauma by shutting down, by building walls so high, so thick that nothing could get in, but also nothing could get out. And Damien Cross had been living inside those walls for 12 years. I closed my laptop, pressed my palms against my eyes. This wasn't just therapy. This wasn't just a job. This was excavation. And the deeper I dug, the more I'd uncover. Pain, grief, the kind of guilt that rewrites your entire existence. I should have referred him out, called him in the morning and told him I wasn't the right fit, given him names of trauma specialists who dealt with survivor's guilt, with complicated grief. But I didn't do that. Because when he'd looked at me in that penthouse with those empty eyes and that broken confession, something in me recognized something in him. We were both trying to save people we couldn't save. He couldn't save his sister. I couldn't save my mother. And maybe, just maybe, we were both drowning in the same ocean, reaching for something, anything to hold on to. I picked up my phone, stared at his contact, typed a message. Thursday, 2 p.m. I'll be there. Then I added something I shouldn't have. You're not alone in this. I deleted it, retyped it, deleted it again. Finally, I just hit send on the first message. But as I climbed into bed, rain drumming its lullaby against the window, I knew the truth. I was already in too deep, and I hadn't even started digging yet. Have you ever met someone and known, just known, that they were going to change everything? That's what Damien Cross felt like. A storm on the horizon. Beautiful, dangerous, inevitable. I told myself I could handle it, that I was a professional, that 6 weeks would come and go and I'd walk away unscathed. But standing at the edge of someone else's darkness, sometimes you don't realize you're falling until you can't see the light anymore. Tell me, would you have walked away, or would you have done exactly what I did? Taken one step closer to the edge?
Thursday came too fast. I stood outside his building, briefcase in hand, looking up at the 47 floors of steel and glass. The sky was overcast, heavy, like the city was holding its breath. I'd rehearsed what I'd say, how I'd approach the session. Professional, controlled. I wouldn't mention what I'd found, wouldn't push too hard. Trauma work required trust, and trust required time. But the moment I stepped into his penthouse, everything I'd planned evaporated. Because Damien Cross wasn't standing by the windows. He was sitting on the floor, back against the glass, knees drawn up, white shirt sleeves rolled to his elbows, a tumbler of amber liquid in his hand. Whiskey, probably. It was 2 in the afternoon, and he looked tired. Not physically, existentially. Like he'd been awake for 12 years and had finally run out of ways to pretend he wasn't exhausted. He glanced up when I entered, didn't stand, didn't apologize, just said my name, Elara. Not Dr. Cole, Elara. The sound of it in his voice did something to my chest, made it tighten in a way that had nothing to do with professional concern. I set my briefcase down, slowly. Didn't sit on the couch. Instead, I did something I'd never done with a client before. I sat on the floor across from him, crossed my legs, smoothed my skirt, met his eyes, and asked if he was okay. He laughed. It was a rough sound, bitter, like he'd forgotten how and his body was remembering wrong. He said he hadn't slept, that he'd tried, but every time he closed his eyes, he saw things he'd spent years trying not to see. I asked, what things? He took a drink, stared into the glass like it held answers. Then he told me about Emma. Not everything, not the details, but enough. He said she'd been 19, brilliant, funny, the kind of person who lit up rooms just by existing. She'd been accepted to Columbia, full ride. She was supposed to start in the fall. They'd been celebrating, dinner with their parents. He'd had 2 drinks, maybe 3, not enough to be drunk, but enough that he should have called a car. She'd wanted to drive with him, said she missed him, that he was always working, always busy, and she just wanted 20 minutes in the car with her big brother. So he said yes. The road was wet. He'd been going too fast. Not reckless, just not careful enough. The truck came out of nowhere. He'd swerved. Wrong direction. Emma's side of the car took the impact. He said he remembered the sound, metal and glass, and something breaking that wasn't the car. He remembered screaming her name, remembered her hand in his, warm, then cold, then nothing. She died before the ambulance arrived, and he walked away with a concussion and 3 broken ribs. His voice didn't shake when he told me this. It stayed flat, controlled, like he was reading a report about someone else's life. But his hand, the one holding the glass, was trembling. I didn't say anything for a long time. What could I say? That it wasn't his fault? He'd heard that 1,000 times. That time heals? It hadn't. That he needed to forgive himself? He couldn't. So instead, I did something I'd been taught never to do. I reached across the space between us and took the glass from his hand, set it aside, and I told him the truth. I said grief isn't something you get over. It's something you learn to carry. And guilt, the kind that lived in your bones, doesn't disappear because someone tells you it should. I said he didn't have to forgive himself. Not today. Maybe not ever. But he did have to stop punishing himself by refusing to feel anything at all. Because Emma didn't die so he could spend the rest of his life buried alive. His jaw clenched, eyes locked on mine, dark and deep and drowning. He asked how I knew that, how I could possibly know what Emma would have wanted. I said I didn't, but I knew what my mother would want. I told him about her, about how Alzheimer's was taking her piece by piece, how some days she knew me, some days she didn't, how I sat with her every Sunday and read her favorite books, even though she couldn't remember the endings anymore, how I'd spent years trying to save her, trying to find the right treatment, the right doctor, the right something that would bring her back, and how I'd finally realized I couldn't save her. All I could do was love her while she was still here, even if she didn't remember, even if it hurt. My voice cracked on the last word. I hadn't meant to tell him that, hadn't meant to let him see me, but there it was, the truth between us, raw and bleeding. He stared at me for what felt like forever. Then he did something that changed everything. He reached out, slow, hesitant, and he put his hand on mine. His palm was warm, rough, solid, and for a moment, just a moment, I forgot how to breathe. He didn't say anything, didn't need to. The touch said it all. You're not alone either. We sat there on the floor of his penthouse, the city sprawling below us, two people trying to hold on to something they couldn't save. And I felt it, a shift. The line we just crossed without meaning to. This wasn't therapy anymore. This was something else entirely. I should have pulled my hand away. I should have stood up, reset the boundary, reminded him and myself that this was professional. But I didn't, because his hand on mine felt like the first honest thing I'd touched in years, and I wasn't ready to let go.
3 weeks passed like water through fingers. Twice a week, I climbed to the 47th floor. Twice a week, the elevator doors opened to that penthouse that felt less like a home and more like a carefully constructed fortress. But something was changing. Small things, almost imperceptible. The first week after he told me about Emma, I arrived to find music playing. Something classical, soft. He said he'd forgotten he used to like music, that it had been easier to live in silence. But silence was starting to feel too loud. The second week, he asked if I wanted tea instead of just offering water. Said he'd noticed I always brought my own, and it seemed like too much effort. There was a kettle on the counter when I arrived. Earl Grey, my favorite. I didn't ask how he knew. The third week, he was smiling when I walked in. Not a big smile, not the kind that reaches your eyes and lights up your whole face, but a smile nonetheless. He'd closed a deal, something about a merger he'd been working on for months. He said he'd expected to feel nothing, the way he always did, but for a split second, just one, he'd felt something like satisfaction, like pride, like maybe he was still capable of wanting things. I told him that was progress. He said maybe. Then he asked if I wanted to sit by the windows instead of the couch. So we did. We sat on the floor, backs against the glass, the city stretching out below us like a living, breathing thing. The sun was setting, gold bleeding into orange, into pink, into purple, and we talked. Not about trauma, not about Emma or my mother or the weight of things we couldn't fix. We talked about small things, normal things. He asked about my day, about the other clients I saw, about whether I always wanted to be a therapist or if it was something I fell into. I told him I'd wanted to be a painter once, that I'd spent my early 20s in a studio apartment, covered in acrylic and hope, convinced I'd make something beautiful enough to matter. But rent doesn't pay itself, and my mother got sick, and somewhere between survival and responsibility, I put down the brushes and picked up textbooks. He asked if I missed it. I said every day. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that made my heart stutter. He said I still made beautiful things, just different ones. That helping people find themselves again was art too. I didn't know what to say to that, so I didn't say anything. We just sat there, shoulders almost touching, watching the city lights flicker on one by one, and for the first time in years, I felt something I'd forgotten existed. Peace. But it wasn't just the sessions that were changing. He started texting me.
not often, not inappropriately, just small things. A photo of a coffee cup with a message, "Found a place that makes Earl Grey the right way. Thought of you." An article about art therapy with a single line, "This made sense after what you said." Once, late at night, just 3 words, "Can't sleep again." I should have maintained boundaries, should have kept it professional, reminded him and myself that clients don't text their therapists at midnight. But I didn't. I texted back, "What are you thinking about?" He said, "Everything, nothing, you." I stared at that message for 20 minutes, typed and deleted a dozen responses. Finally sent, "Try counting backwards from 100, it helps." He replied, "I got to 87 before I started counting the reasons I shouldn't be texting you." My chest tightened. I asked, "How many reasons did you find?" He said, "Not enough." I didn't respond after that, but I didn't delete the message either. I kept it, read it again before I fell asleep, let it settle into the spaces between my ribs where doubt and wanting lived. The 4th week, something shifted. I arrived to find him standing by the windows, hands in his pockets, shoulders tense. He didn't turn when I entered, just asked if I had ever crossed a line I couldn't uncross. My breath caught. I asked what he meant. He said he'd been thinking about rules, about the distance we're supposed to keep from the people we let in, about whether those rules exist to protect us or to keep us from finding something real. I set my briefcase down, slowly, told him that boundaries exist for a reason, that therapist-client relationships have power imbalances, that feelings developed in this context aren't always what they seem. He turned then, eyes locked on mine, asked if that's what he thought this was, a construct, a transference, something that would dissolve the moment our 6 weeks ended? I opened my mouth to say yes, that's exactly what it was, but the word wouldn't come, because I'd be lying, and we'd both know it. He took a step closer, then another, until he was standing right in front of me, close enough that I could smell his cologne, cedar and something darker, close enough that I could see the silver flakes in his dark eyes, close enough that my pulse was hammering in my throat. He said my name, not Dr. Cole, Ilara, soft, rough, like a prayer and a plea all at once. He said he knew this was complicated, that he was paying me, that there were rules, that maybe everything I felt was just my brain trying to make sense of intensity and proximity. But he needed to know, was it just him, or did I feel it too? The thing we weren't saying, the thing that lived in the space between us every time we sat too close, every time our eyes met and held too long, every time the session ended and neither of us wanted to leave. I should have said no, should have stepped back, reset the boundary, ended the session right there. But I didn't, because I was tired of lying, tired of pretending my heart didn't race every time I walked into this penthouse, tired of telling myself that what I felt was clinical concern and nothing more. So I told him the truth. I said it wasn't just him. And the moment the words left my mouth, everything changed. He didn't kiss me, not then, but the way he looked at me, like I was the answer to a question he'd been asking his whole life, that was more dangerous than any kiss could ever be, because I looked back the same way, and we both knew there was no going back from this.
I didn't expect to see him outside the penthouse. It was Sunday, my day, the one day I reserved for myself, for my mother, for the parts of my life that existed beyond that 47th floor. I was at the hospital, the care facility where my mother lived now. sitting in the garden courtyard, reading to her from Pride and Prejudice, her favorite, though she couldn't remember why anymore. She was having a bad day. She'd called me Sarah twice, asked where her sister was, her sister who'd been dead for 15 years. Looked at me like I was a stranger wearing a familiar face. I kept reading anyway, my voice steady even as something inside me cracked a little more. That's when I heard it. His voice, low, quiet, saying my name. Ilara. I looked up, and there he was. Damien Cross, standing at the edge of the courtyard in jeans and a dark sweater. No suit, no armor, hair slightly disheveled like he'd run his hands through it too many times. He looked human, real, and completely out of place in this garden of forgotten memories. I closed the book, slowly. My mother had already drifted off, chin tucked to her chest, lost in whatever dream world she lived in now. I stood, walked over to him, far enough away that we wouldn't disturb her. Asked what he was doing here. He said he'd been driving, just driving. No destination, no plan, and somehow he'd ended up here. I didn't ask how he knew where my mother was. I didn't want to know. Didn't want to think about him looking into my life the way I'd looked into his. But part of me, the part that was tired and raw and breaking, was just grateful I wasn't alone. He asked if I was okay. Such a simple question, but the way he said it, the way he looked at me, like he actually cared about the answer, like my pain mattered to him in a way that had nothing to do with therapy or professional concern. I told him the truth. I said no, that I wasn't okay, that watching my mother disappear piece by piece was the hardest thing I'd ever done, that some days I wanted to stop coming, stop watching, stop hurting. But I couldn't, because she was still here, still breathing, still existing, and as long as she was, I'd keep showing up, even if she didn't know me anymore. My voice broke on the last word, and before I could stop him, before I could remember all the reasons this was wrong, Damien stepped forward and pulled me into his arms. No warning, no hesitation, just his arms around me, solid, warm, real. I should have pulled away. Should have reminded him about boundaries, about the rules we were breaking just by standing here. But I didn't. I let myself break instead. Let myself press my face against his chest and feel the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. Let his hand cradle the back of my head while I shook with tears I'd been holding back for months. Let myself be held by someone who understood what it meant to lose pieces of the people you love. He didn't say anything, didn't tell me it would be okay or that time heals, or any of the hollow platitudes people offer when they don't know what else to say. He just held me, and somehow that was enough. We stayed like that for a long time. When I finally pulled back, wiping my face, embarrassed and exposed, he didn't let me go completely. His hands stayed on my shoulders, grounding me. He said he was sorry for showing up unannounced, for crossing a line, for making this more complicated than it already was. But he'd been thinking about me, about what I'd said about carrying grief, about learning to feel again. And he realized something. He said I'd spent weeks helping him excavate the parts of himself he'd buried, asking him to feel, to open up, to let someone in. But who was doing that for me? Who was holding space for my grief, for my exhaustion, for the weight I carried every day? I told him I was fine, that I was the therapist, that my job was to hold space for others, not the other way around. He said that was bullshit, that I was human too, that I was allowed to break, allowed to need someone, allowed to let him be that someone. The way he said it, the intensity in his eyes, it wasn't about therapy anymore. It wasn't about client and doctor.
It was about two people who had found each other in the wreckage of their own grief and realized they didn't want to let go. I asked him what we were doing, what this was, what it was becoming. He said he didn't know, but he knew what he wanted it to be. And then he asked the question I'd been terrified to hear. He asked if our 6 weeks ended, if we weren't bound by contracts and ethics boards and professional distance, would I still want to see him? Not as a client, as something else. My heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. I said yes. Before I could think, before I could list all the reasons it was a terrible idea, I said yes. Because the truth was, I'd been thinking about it too, about what came after, about whether this thing between us could exist outside that penthouse, outside the structure that made it safe and contained, whether what we had was real, or just a beautiful accident born from proximity and pain. He smiled then, a real smile, full, genuine, and God, it was devastating. He said we had 2 weeks left on our contract, 2 more sessions, and then he'd do things the right way. He'd wait the required time, follow whatever protocols I needed, give me space to refer him to someone else, do everything by the book. But after that, he was asking me on a date. A real one. No contracts, no boundaries, just him and me. I laughed. It came out shaky, breathless. I said he was assuming I would say yes. He said he was hoping. And the way he looked at me when he said it, like hope was something he'd forgotten how to feel, like I'd handed it back to him, like I was something worth hoping for. I told him I'd think about it. He said that was all he could ask. Then he walked me back to my mother, sat with us while I finished reading, didn't say a word, just existed beside me, a steady presence in the chaos. When visiting hours ended, he walked me to my car, and before I got in, he did something that made my breath catch. He took my hand, raised it to his lips, and pressed a kiss to my knuckles. Soft, gentle, reverent. Like I was something precious he was afraid to break. Then he let me go, said he'd see me Thursday, and walked away. I sat in my car for 20 minutes after he left, hand pressed to my chest, heart racing, mind spinning. 2 weeks, 2 more sessions, and then everything would change. The question was I ready for that? Was I ready to let someone in who'd spent 12 years keeping everyone out? Was I ready to risk my heart on a man who was just learning how to feel again? I didn't know. But as I drove home through the city lights, his kiss still burning on my skin,
I realized I wanted to find out.
Thursday came, our second to last session. I should have been relieved, should have felt like the finish line was in sight. 2 more sessions and we'd be free to explore whatever this was without the weight of ethics violations hanging over our heads. But when I stepped into his penthouse that afternoon, something was wrong. The air felt different, heavier. Damien was standing by the windows, rigid, hands clenched at his sides. He didn't turn when I entered, didn't say my name, just stood there, staring at the city like it held answers he couldn't find. I set my briefcase down, asked if he was okay. He said we needed to talk. Those 4 words, the ones that never mean anything good. My stomach dropped. He turned then, and the look on his face, it was the same emptiness I'd seen in our first session. The walls rebuilt, the fortress locked, like the past 5 weeks had never happened. He said he'd been thinking about us, about what we were doing, about what came next, and he'd realized something. He said he couldn't do it, couldn't ask me to wait for him, couldn't ask me to risk my career, my reputation, everything I'd built for something that might not even be real. I felt the words like a physical blow, asked him what he meant, what had changed. He said nothing had changed. That was the problem. He said he'd spent 12 years not feeling anything, and then I walk into his life and suddenly he was feeling everything. Pain, grief, hope, want. But how could he trust it? How could he know if what he felt for me was real or just his brain latching onto the first person who'd made him feel anything at all? He said I deserved better than that, better than being someone's experiment, someone's maybe, someone's first attempt at feeling human again. I deserved certainty, and he couldn't give me that. My throat tightened, hands trembling. I asked him if that's really what he thought this was. He said he didn't know, and that was exactly the problem. I stood there, the city sprawling behind him, and felt something inside me crack. Because I understood. God, I understood. Isn't that what I'd been telling myself for weeks? That this might just be transference, proximity, two broken people mistaking shared pain for connection. But understanding didn't make it hurt less. I asked him what he wanted me to say. He said nothing. That he just needed me to know that when our 6 weeks ended, he wouldn't be calling, wouldn't be asking me out, wouldn't be showing up at hospitals or texting me at midnight. That it was better to end it now, clean, before we crossed lines we couldn't uncross, before someone got hurt. I wanted to scream, wanted to tell him it was too late for that I was already hurt, that walking away now wouldn't protect either of us. It would just prove that he was still too afraid to feel anything real. But I didn't, because he was looking at me with those empty eyes, and I realized something. He wasn't pushing me away because he didn't feel anything. He was pushing me away because he felt too much, and it terrified him. So I did the only thing I could do. I let him. I picked up my briefcase, told him I understood, that if that's what he needed, I'd respect it, that I'd see him next week for our final session, and then I'd close his case, refer him to someone else, someone who could help him without the complication of whatever this was between us. He nodded, jaw tight, eyes fixed on some point past my shoulder, said that was probably best. I walked to the elevator, hand on the button, and then I heard him, quiet, almost too quiet to hear. He said my name. Alara. I turned. He was still by the windows, but his hand was pressed against the glass, palm flat, like he was trying to hold himself back, or hold himself together. He said he was sorry, for all of it, for being a mess, for pulling me into his chaos, for making me care about someone who didn't know how to be cared about. I felt tears burning behind my eyes. Told him he didn't need to apologize for being human. That's all he'd ever been, just human, scared and grieving and trying to survive the weight of what he'd lost. And that was okay. He was allowed to be that, but he was also allowed to want more, to reach for something good, to let someone love him even if he didn't know how to love himself yet. I said I'd been thinking too, about what he asked me, about whether I'd still want to see him after our contract ended, and I'd realized something. I said I didn't need him to be certain. I didn't need him to have all the answers or know exactly what he was feeling. I just needed him to be brave enough to try, because I was already all in. I'd been all in since the moment he told me about Emma, since he held me in the garden, since he looked at me like I was the first real thing he'd seen in years. And if he wanted to walk away, if he genuinely believed that what we had wasn't worth the risk, then I'd let him. But if he was just scared, then I needed him to know something. I was scared too. Terrified, actually. But I was willing to be terrified together if it meant we had a chance at something real. The silence stretched between us. Long, heavy, fragile. And then he moved, fast, purposeful, crossed the space between us in 3 strides, and kissed me. His hands framed my face, desperate, gentle, like I was the only solid thing in a world that wouldn't stop spinning. And I kissed him back, fingers twisting in his shirt, heart hammering, years of loneliness and grief and careful control shattering into something raw and real and utterly terrifying. It wasn't soft, wasn't careful. It was need and hope
and all the words we'd been too afraid to say. When we finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, foreheads pressed together, he said something that made my chest ache. He said he didn't know how to do this, didn't know how to be with someone, didn't know if he'd be any good at it, but he wanted to try, if I'd let him. I said yes. Before he could change his mind, before fear could rebuild the walls, I said yes. We stood there tangled in each other, the city glowing beyond the windows, and I knew, God, I knew that everything was about to get so much more complicated, because we'd just crossed the line we'd been dancing around for weeks, and there was no going back. Have you ever wanted something so badly you'd risk everything for it, even knowing it might destroy you? Tell me I'm not crazy for this. Tell me you'd have done the same thing.
The call came on Monday morning. I was in my office, between clients, staring at a cup of coffee I couldn't bring myself to drink, still replaying Thursday. The kiss, his hands, the way he looked at me like I was oxygen and he'd been drowning. We hadn't spoken since. No texts, no calls, just silence and the weight of what we'd done sitting heavy on my chest. My phone rang. Unknown number. I answered. A woman's voice. Professional. Clipped. She said her name was Dr. Patricia Morgan. She was the head of the State Licensing Board's Ethics Committee, and she needed to speak with me about a complaint that had been filed. The world tilted. I asked what kind of complaint. She said she couldn't discuss details over the phone, but it involved a current client. Allegations of boundary violations, inappropriate dual relationships. She asked if I could come in for a meeting Thursday afternoon. I said yes. What else could I say? She thanked me, said she'd send the formal documentation, and hung up. I sat there, phone still pressed to my ear, heart hammering so hard I thought it might crack my ribs. Someone knew. Someone had seen us, or found out, or guessed, and they'd reported me. My career, my license, everything I'd worked for, gone, just like that. Because I'd fallen for a client. Because I'd crossed a line I knew better than to cross. Because I'd let myself want something I shouldn't have. I called him. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone. He answered on the first ring, said my name like a question, like he'd been waiting. I told him about the call, about the ethics board, about the meeting, about how everything we'd risked was about to cost me everything I had. The silence on the other end was deafening. Then he said something I didn't expect. He said it was him. Not that he'd reported me, but that someone in his world had. He said he'd been at a business dinner over the weekend. One of his competitors, a man who'd been trying to leverage a deal for months, had made a comment about his therapist, about how Damien had seemed different lately, softer, almost human. And wasn't that interesting? Damien said he'd shut it down, but the man had smiled, the kind of smile that meant he'd already won something, and now I was paying the price. I felt sick, asked him what we were going to do. He said he'd fix it, that he had lawyers, resources, that he could make this go away. I told him no, that using his money to bury this would only make it worse, would prove everything the complaint probably said, that I'd compromised my ethics, that I'd let his wealth and influence cloud my judgment, that I'd been bought. He said that's not what happened. I said it didn't matter. That's what it would look like. And in a field built on trust and boundaries, appearances were everything. The silence stretched between us. Finally, I said what I'd been trying not to think. I said maybe we made a mistake, that maybe we moved too fast, wanted too much, let ourselves believe we could have something that was never meant to exist. He said my name, Alara, desperate, raw, but I kept talking. I told him I'd go to the meeting, answer their questions, accept whatever consequences came, and that we needed to stop. Completely. No more contact, no more texts, no more pretending this could work.
Because the truth was, I couldn't lose everything I'd built. Not for something that might not survive outside the walls of his penthouse. Not for a man who was still learning how to feel. He asked if that's really what I wanted. My throat burned with unshed tears. I said it was what I needed. For both of us. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, okay. Just that. Okay. Like I'd broken something in him he'd just learned how to use. I told him I was sorry. He said he was too. And then he hung up. I sat in my office, staring at the phone in my hand, and felt everything inside me shatter. This was supposed to be different. He was supposed to be different. We were supposed to find a way. But reality didn't care about supposed to. It didn't care about feelings or hope or two broken people trying to piece each other back together. It cared about rules, ethics, the lines we weren't allowed to cross. And I'd crossed them anyway. Now I was paying the price. Thursday came too fast. I sat in a sterile conference room across from Dr. Morgan and two other board members, all professional smiles and serious eyes. They asked me about Damien Cross, about our sessions, about whether I'd maintained appropriate boundaries. I told them the truth, that our therapeutic relationship had become complicated, that feelings had developed, that we'd kissed once but that nothing else had happened, that I immediately recognized the ethical violation and ended our professional relationship. They asked if he'd pressured me, coerced me, used his wealth or influence to compromise my judgment. I said no, that if anything, I'd been the one who had failed, who'd let personal feelings interfere with professional responsibility, that I took full accountability for my actions. Dr. Morgan made notes, asked more questions about our sessions, about the nature of his payment, about whether I'd consulted with a supervisor. I answered everything, honest, direct, not trying to hide or minimize, just accepting what I'd done and what it would cost. At the end, they said they'd review everything and be in touch with their decision, that it could take weeks, maybe months, that in the meantime, I should consider continuing my practice was appropriate. I nodded, thanked them for their time, and walked out into the hallway where the fluorescent lights felt too bright and the air too thin. I'd just lost everything. And the worst part, I still didn't regret kissing him. I went home that night and sat in the dark. No music, no TV, just silence and the ghost of what we'd almost had. And I wondered if he was sitting in his penthouse the same way, 47 floors up, staring at the city, wondering if I'd been worth the risk, wondering if he'd ever feel anything again, or if I'd just been another thing he'd learned to lose.
3 months passed like walking through fog. I kept working, saw my clients, showed up for my mother every Sunday, moved through the motions of a life that felt half-lived. The ethics board cleared me, issued a formal warning, required additional supervision for a year, but I kept my license. Dr. Morgan had said I'd been honest, that I'd self-reported and taken accountability, that mistakes didn't have to define a career if you learned from them. I thanked her and went home to an empty apartment that felt even emptier than before, because I'd learned all right. I'd learned what it felt like to want something so badly you'd risk everything, and I'd learned what it cost to walk away. I hadn't heard from Damien. No texts, no calls, no surprise visits. Just silence. The kind that felt like grief. I told myself it was better this way, that we both moved on, that what we'd had was always meant to be temporary, a moment, not a lifetime. But late at night, when the city was quiet and sleep wouldn't come, I'd think about him, wonder if he was okay, if he'd found another therapist, if he'd learned to keep feeling, or if he'd bury everything again.
Wonder if he ever thought about me. It was a Tuesday when everything changed. I was closing up my office, late evening, the building mostly empty. My last client had canceled, and I was just packing up to go home. Then I heard the elevator, footsteps in the hallway, a knock on my door. I opened it, and there he was, Damien Cross. Dark jeans, black coat, hair longer than I remembered, eyes that weren't empty anymore. They were nervous. He said my name, Ilara, like he'd been practicing how to say it. Asked if he could come in. I should have said no, should have reminded him about boundaries, about the warning I just received, about all the reasons this was still a terrible idea. But I stepped aside, let him in, closed the door behind us. He stood in the middle of my small office, hands in his pockets, looking around like he was memorizing it. The books on my shelves, the painting on the wall, one I'd done years ago before I gave up on art, the window that looked out over the city. He said he'd wanted to call every single day for 3 months, but he'd made me a promise that he'd do things the right way, that he'd give me space, that he wouldn't complicate my life more than he already had. So he'd waited. He'd found a new therapist, a man named Dr. Chen, who specialized in trauma. He'd been going twice a week, doing the work, actually doing it, learning how to sit with feelings instead of burying them, learning how to grieve, how to forgive himself for things he couldn't change, learning how to be the kind of person who deserved something good. My throat tightened. He said he'd also dealt with the complaint, not by burying it or using his money to make it disappear, but by going to the board himself. He'd written a statement, testified, made it clear that I'd done nothing wrong, that he'd been the one who pushed, who'd crossed boundaries, who'd made things complicated, that I'd acted with integrity every step of the way, and that if there was any fault, it was his. The board had accepted his statement. It was part of why they'd cleared me. I hadn't known. He said he didn't want me to know, didn't want me to feel obligated or guilty or like I owed him anything. He just wanted me to keep my license, to keep doing the work that mattered to me, even if it meant he never saw me again. I felt tears burning behind my eyes. Asked him why he was here. If he'd done all of that, if he'd given me space and time and freedom, why was he standing in my office now? He took a breath, deep, steadying. Then he told me. He said 3 months ago, he was terrified. Terrified of feeling, terrified of wanting, terrified of losing something he'd just found. So he'd convinced himself it wasn't real, that it was just transference or proximity, or two broken people mistaking pain for connection. But he'd spent 3 months without me. 3 months of silence, of empty penthouses and therapy sessions where he had to talk about the woman he'd pushed away because he was too afraid to fight for her. And he'd realized something. What he felt for me wasn't going away. It wasn't fading or dissolving or proving itself to be a construct. It was getting stronger. Every day, every session, every moment he had to sit with the truth. He loved me. He didn't know when it happened. Maybe the first time I'd looked at him and seen past the walls. Maybe when I'd sat on the floor with him and told him grief is something you carry. Maybe when he'd held my hand in a hospital garden. Or maybe it was all of it. Every moment building into something he couldn't deny anymore. He said he loved me. And he knew this was complicated, that there were rules and ethics and 1,000 reasons it shouldn't work. But he'd spent 12 years not fighting for anything except money and deals and things that didn't matter. And he was done. He was ready to fight for something real. For me. If I'd let him. The tears spilled over. I'd spent 3 months telling myself I'd made the right choice, that walking away was protecting us both. But standing there, looking at him, at this man who'd learned to feel again, who'd fought through his own darkness, who'd shown up anyway, I realized something. I loved him too. I'd loved him since the moment he told me about Emma, since he held me when I broke, since he'd kissed me like I was the only real thing in his world. And I was tired of being afraid, tired of choosing safety over something that made me feel alive. So I told him. I said I loved him too. And I watched his face transform, the fear melting into relief, into joy, into something so raw and beautiful that it hurt to look at. He asked if that meant he could kiss me. I said yes. And he did. Slow this time, gentle, like we had all the time in the world, like we weren't stolen moments or secret risks, like we were just two people who'd found each other in the wreckage and decided to rebuild together. When we pulled apart, foreheads pressed together, both smiling through tears, he said something that made my heart full. He said he didn't know what came next, didn't know how we'd navigate the complications, or the questions, or the people who wouldn't understand. But he knew one thing. He wasn't running anymore. And neither was I. We stood there in my little office, the city glowing beyond the window, and I thought about beginnings, about how sometimes the bravest thing you can do is let someone in. Let them see the broken parts, the scared parts, the parts you've spent years trying to hide, and trust that they'll stay anyway. Damien Cross had paid me to fix him, but he didn't need fixing. He just needed someone to show him it was safe to feel again. And maybe, just maybe, I needed the same thing. Someone to remind me that it was okay to want more than survival. That it was okay to reach for joy, even when grief still lived in your bones. That love wasn't about being whole. It was about being brave enough to be broken together. 6 months later, I stood in that same hospital garden. My mother was having a good day. She knew my name, asked about my life. I told her about him, about the man who I'd walked into his office and taught to see again. She smiled, said she was happy for me. And when Damien arrived, bringing coffee and flowers and that smile I'd never get tired of seeing, she looked at him and said something that made my heart catch. She said, "You're the one who makes her glow." He took my hand, squeezed gently, said she did that for me first. And in that moment, surrounded by flowers and fading memories and a love that had survived every rule we'd broken, I knew we'd be okay. We'd made it through the darkness, and we were learning together how to live in the light. So tell me, do you believe people can truly change? That love can heal the parts of us that we thought were beyond repair?
That sometimes the biggest risks lead to the most beautiful rewards? I didn't believe it 3 months ago. But standing here now, hand in his, heart full, I believe it with everything I am. Leave a comment. Tell me your story. Have you ever taken a risk on love? Have you ever let someone in even when you were terrified? Because maybe, just maybe, we're all just looking for someone brave enough to see us and stay anyway.